Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Welcome back, adventurers. Today is a special edition here for Captain TTRPG because we are talking about the most recent playtest, the impossible playtest for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Love the name. I'm sure it'll make sense later, even though it doesn't make sense to me right now. In this playtest, Paizo has brought us two new classes, just the new classes, nothing else in the playtest, but that's enough. We got two new classes coming in. And one of these classes I think many people have thought about for a long time and hope to see it, and that is the Necromancer. And the other I think some may have seen coming. I personally was surprised by it, and that is the Runesmith. And today's video will be focused on exactly that, the Runesmith. I'll save the Necromancer for a different video. So what are runesmiths? Runesmiths are magical support marshals that have spell-like abilities via tracing and etching runes onto creatures, onto weapons, armor, shields. They wield magic that isn't spells, but is spell-like. Now, as I mentioned, these are partially martial characters. They are a martial character, but strength and dex, neither one is their primary ability score. In fact, it is intelligence. When I say they are martials, they're martials in the same way that alchemists and inventors are martials, which is to say, yes, they are martial characters. They can fight, whether it's up in the fray or further back, but intelligence is their primary ability score. What does this mean? It means that they're going to be great at having a lot of skills. It means that they're going to be great at specific skills, things like crafting, as we see is pretty common with the intelligence-based classes, but other things like occultism or arcana. So lots of value to intelligence itself. As a class, Runesmiths get 8 hit points per level. This doesn't put them up there with your core martials, of course, things like fighters and rangers and barbarians, but it does still fit alongside other classes like we see with the thaumaturge or the inventor or things like that. They are trained in both light and medium armor and unarmored. They are trained in basic and martial weapons as any martial class should be. The primary feature of the Runesmith is unsurprisingly their runes. In fact, they don't even get a subclass. Their subclass is whatever selection of runes you decide to take. These runes are magical etchings or tracings. So they are infused markings that you supply onto something. There are two kinds of runes. There are your standard basic runes, which are runes themselves etched directly onto something. And there are your diacritic runes, which augment a rune you already have etched or traced onto something. Standard runes provide two things. First, they'll provide a passive effect once etched or traced on. And the second is they have an ability that can be invoked. We'll get into what both those mean in a second. So up on screen here, I've put one of the runes. This is the Flame rune. And we'll cover more of the runes later. Not all of them in the playtest, but we'll cover some more of them. You notice that for the Flame rune, you can also see here that there's something that happens when it is invoked. In this case, when invoked, it will explode and deal fire damage to the creature with a basic fortitude saving throw, at which point the rune itself will disappear from the creature. Diacritic runes augment these basic runes like the Flame rune. We'll see some combinations later I talk about, but for instance, there's a diacritic rune where if applied to, say, the Flame rune, when you invoke the Flame rune, they will both trigger, and you will not only do the d6s of damage for the Flame rune, but you will also add on to that damage your intelligence modifier. So just one example of what a diacritic rune can do. So how do we get runes onto creatures or objects? Well, we have two ways. We can etch them, or we can trace them. Etching a rune is semi-permanent. You can do this in exploration mode, or you can do it at the end of your daily preparations. Now, you can only start by etching 2 at a time. The number that you can have etched active at a time increases as you level up pretty quickly, so I wouldn't worry too much about that restriction, but at level 1, it is 2. And these etched runes will stay on until they are invoked. And if they aren't invoked, they will disappear at the end, they will disappear during next daily preparations where you can etch 2 others. Finally, with etching, you need to have Artisan's Toolkit with you while you are doing the etchings, as this is a more permanent design. Tracing runes is a short-lived version, so you don't need to sit down and etch for 10 minutes, which is how long it takes normally when you're doing it in exploration mode. Instead, you're able to do this with 1 or 2 actions. If you're going to etch onto a creature or object that is within your melee range, that's 1 action. If you want to trace a rune at up to 30 feet away, you need to use 2 actions to do it. Now, these are not these semi-permanent runes. Instead, these will only last until the end of your next turn. So if you're going to want to trace them and you're going to want to invoke them, you have to keep that in mind. So we've got the actions it takes to trace a rune, 1 or 2, and we need to have a hand free while we trace a rune in order to trace it at all. So no holding on to 2 weapons while you trace your runes. Okay, so you've got some etched runes, you've got some trace runes. How about invoking the runes? Well, invoking a rune takes 1 action, and you can invoke all the runes you want within 30 feet. So you may have 2 etched runes and maybe 3 traced runes, possibly, all out at once. You want to trigger them all? Trigger them all. It just takes 1 action to do all of that. When you invoke, it triggers as many as you're planning on triggering. After you invoke, any rune that was invoked will disappear, including the etched ones. So etched or traced, they are then gone, which means the passive benefits are also gone, but you get that massive invoke benefit, whatever it may be. One thing to keep in mind is if on a turn you wanted to trace a rune at ranged and invoke all in the same turn, you can do that, but that will take all 3 of your actions. So that may or may not be a good choice for you as a style of play, but it is an option. Now that we understand the basics of runes, let's talk about how you build a character and the options you have. So again, we have no subclasses, which means your subclass is the set of runes you are choosing. Now, at level 1, you're going to get to choose 4 first level runes that are part of your runic repertoire. You'll get to add 1 more rune every odd level. So you'll end up with a good set of runes. There are, right now in the playtest at least, there are level 1, level 9, and level 17 runes. Let's talk about some of these runes and just get an idea of what they're all about. All right, so I already showed this once before, but here we are with Atril, Rune of Fire, where we talked about the passive benefit of reducing an enemy's fire resistance. And then when you trigger it, the invoke deals 2d6 damage with a basic fortitude save. Now, as you heighten that, you'll not only increase the amount of resistance you reduce, but you'll increase the damage you deal by 2d6, and it heightens every 2 of your levels, not 2 spell levels. So at 3, 5, 7, 9, this is going up by 2d6 damage, which is substantial. Asvidir, Rune of the Whetstone, is etched or traced onto a weapon. And in this case, the passive benefit is that, slashing or piercing, I should say, and still a level 1 rune, is that whenever you hit with such a weapon, or the rune bearer hits with this weapon, that weapon deals 2 persistent bleed damage. There's no save here. It just deals 2 persistent bleed damage when you hit. Now, obviously, from the same source, that's not going to stack. It'll replace itself. But 2 persistent bleed damage is nothing to scoff at. When you invoke this rune, you will deal 2d6 slashing damage to a creature adjacent to the weapon, which usually means whoever you're fighting at the time. And again, heightening every 2 levels, this is going to go up by another 2d6 damage. Holtrick, Rune of the Dwarven Ramparts. This is going to go onto a shield, and the passive buff is you get +1 bonus to AC above what it normally gives when you raise a shield, which is really nice. When you invoke it, you get to raise the shield for the bearer, because again, it doesn't have to be you, and that +1 bonus applies until the start of the creature's next turn. So if you've got an ally you've etched this onto, it can give them a nice bonus while you get to raise the shield for them, so they didn't have to waste an action to do so. Another level 1 rune, Ronshu, Rune of Thunder. This is onto a creature or object, and the passive's interesting here. If it doesn't move, by the end of its next turn, it will take 1d4 electricity damage. On objects, that's kind of a weird concept, but on a creature, you can see moving or not moving, making sense here. And there's no save, they just take that damage. When you invoke it, kind of like the Flame Rune. This will be 2d6 electricity damage with a basic Fortitude save. And once again, we get some nice heightening here. And added 1 damage if they don't move by the end of their turn, and 2d6 more damage when you invoke the rune. All right, let's get into some of the diacritic runes here. Sun, diacritic rune of preservation, also level 1. Now, these type of runes don't have a passive and an invoke. Instead, they just have an applied ability that will trigger when you invoke a different rune. In this case, whatever rune you put it on, it will reapply the associated rune after it's invoked. So if you had, say, the Flame Rune, and you invoked it to cause damage, it would then retrace the Flame Rune directly back onto the creature, and then this diacritic rune of preservation would disappear. You can only apply this once per 10 minutes, but still quite good. Then we have the diacritic rune of intensity, which I talked about earlier. When you deal damage when invoking a rune, it will add your intelligence ability score to the damage. All right, going up a little higher now, let's talk about some of these other ones. Here's a level 9, Trollistry, Rune of the Forlorn Sorrow. This is onto a creature or armor. All squares between the rune bearer and enemies within 20 feet are treated as difficult terrain. That is the passive. So if you want every creature to have to work really hard to get to an ally, you toss this on that ally, you etch it on their armor at the beginning of the day, creatures are going to have a really hard time approaching your wizard, let's say. When you invoke it, all enemies within 20 feet of the rune bearer must succeed at a will save or be slowed 1 on a crit failure as they sob. Yes, they're going to cry and it slows them down. No matter the outcome, they're immune for 1 day. And let's talk about one of our level 17 runes, Rovon, Seal of the Dead Vault. This is etched or traced onto a creature. The passive benefit has no incapacitation trait. It provides a minus 20-foot penalty to land speeds and a minus 40 to all other speeds. And if it was a flying creature, it can't fly or arrest its fall while this is applied. No incapacitation, it's just passive. You trace it on, it'll work. Then when you invoke it, this does have incapacitation sadly, but it's worth noting, then a 10-foot area around the creature is permanent difficult terrain. The creature must make a Fortitude save. On a success, they're slowed 1 for a round. On a failure, they're slowed 2 for a round. And on a crit fail, they're slowed 2, immobilized, blinded, and petrified as rock wraps around them. And if they can't escape in 3 rounds, they are going to be permanently encased in rock unless it is dispelled. That's pretty cool and sounds amazing to see. Yes, that part does have the incapacitation trait, but it's still very cool. So as you can see, many of the runes have variable bonuses. You get some damage, some buffs, some control, some debuffing, allowing you to play a lot of roles in the party. The one glaring issue thus far with the rune system is the action economy. It's a lot of actions to set all this up and utilize the runes while still trying to act as a martial character. Thankfully, we have some feats to really help out with that. They aren't going to totally solve the problem for you, but they can help in a big way. Again, I'm not going to be going through all of the feats here. I'm just going to talk about a few specific feats, and then we'll talk a little bit more about creating a level 1 version of a Runesmith. So the first one I want to talk about is Engraving Strike. This takes 1 action. Keep in mind you have to have a free hand whenever you're tracing a rune, with very few exceptions. We'll get to that. And you have to have a melee weapon equipped. In this case, for 1 action, you are going to trace in reverse a rune on your weapon and then strike. If your strike hits, you also trace that rune onto the creature that you struck, helping you out with some action economy. Yes, if you don't land the strike, you're not going to apply the rune, which is unfortunate, but at least it helps with some action compression. Remote Detonation. This is actually a free action. It's for level 1, and it's only once per round. And I should mention that with the Engraving Strike as well. Still true. In this case, you're going to fire a ranged strike of some sort. And so with this reaction, it says on the next ranged strike, if you hit, you can invoke all runes on that creature. It has to be within the first range increment of your ranged weapon, And on a crit, they get a -1 penalty to their saving throws. But most importantly, this is a free action to trigger or invoke all of your runes where it normally would have cost you 1 action. So nice action compression again for ranged characters. And finally, another one to help with your actions at level 1 is Rune Singer. In this case, you get to use performance instead of crafting for crafting checks. That's the small piece of it. The big one is once per minute, you can trace a rune with song, requiring no hands at all. And if it's the 2-action version, it only costs 1 action to do. So if you want to trace a rune on a creature at range, you could sing it to just get 1 action to apply it, which is nice. And because Pathfinder2e combats tend to be fairly short, making it once per combat really isn't that terrible. Making all 3 of these actually pretty solid first level feats that really help define the way you might want to play. Let's talk about a few others just to get an idea of what they can do. So at level 2, we've got Runic Tattoo. We talk about etching things that are semi-permanent. We're going to get a little more permanent than that. In this case, you're going to choose 1 of the runes you know, and you're going to etch it onto your body. When etched onto your body, it means you'll get the passive benefit for as long as it's active, and then if you invoke it, it doesn't disappear. No, instead, what it does is it deactivates until the next day. So you can only trigger it once per day, but at least you get to trigger it every day without impacting the number of etched runes you can have, and it's something you know will always be there for you. If we look back at our runes, we had, say, the Whetstone option, adding that permanent passive if you never invoke it. So lots of interesting options for you on what you might want to do with this one. And then another level 2, and I bring this up because of what it's etched onto, this helps you with your shield etchings. It's for 1 action called Fortifying Knock, also once per round, and you raise your shield and trace a rune onto it for 1 action. You still need a free hand to trace, so keep in mind you've got a free hand and a shield at this point, but for 1 action you get to raise and give yourself that +1 bonus and be able to invoke it later. That can be really useful. When it comes to ability scores, we rely heavily on weapons, so what direction you want to go with your ability scores will be determined by what kind of playstyle you want. I'm going to mention a few here and throw them up. So I've got 4 suggestions here of ways to build your ability scores. Intelligence is going to be your primary. That's just always the case. Not only is it the primary ability score for the class, but it's important to have that high because of your class DC, which relates to every invoking of runes. Well, most runes that get invoked require your save DC in some way. So we want to keep that high. When we look at the other options, we've got ranged builds. No surprise, we want Dex really to be our highest. And at that point, if we're staying at ranged, pick your poison for the other 4. If you want to be able to identify creatures, maybe you want another mental score. If you want to have more con for more hit points, that might make sense. But you probably don't need strength. When we look at finesse melee weapon builds, it's a little more prescriptive. Int and then Dex. So Dex getting our +3, and then probably some strength and con, but at least some strength to add a little more damage to your weapon attacks. I would say probably con after that, as the other mental scores really don't play heavily into this class. And then for your, of course, non-finesse melee builds, your big one-handed D8 weapon damage builds, maxing int, and then of course +3 strength, and then 1 dex for your armor and constitution because you're going to be up in combat, charisma, wisdom, whichever one you feel like. And finally, if you want to go a just rune casting build, no weapons, you just want to keep with tracing runes out there, invoking them, but keeping a shield ready for being able to block, maybe be up on the front lines, and tracing in melee. Int with a con choice as your secondary can be an interesting design with dex after that to make sure your armor stays high. But I think there is a possibility of an interesting build that really leans heavily into the tracing and invoking of runes only. A recommended build I would have for a first level character would be a one-handed strength melee weapon build. So let's take something like a battle axe, because you could hold it with 2 hands if you want to for a little higher dice once you've done all your tracing for the turn, if you really want to spend that action on it. For armor, you've got chainmail, just because it only requires a +1 dex max, which is all we're going to be able to afford with our build. Makes our ability scores +4 in int, +3 strength, 1 in con, and 1 in dex to start us off. And with class feats, I would say one of the following, unless of course you're human and then you can take both. I would take Runic Strike. That just feels very right to me in this case. We're a melee build, great. And the other one I think that you could probably take, and I'm not saying you would have to, but looking at the level 1 feats, I really like this as an option, just because it frees you up once per combat, is the Rune Singer. So if we want to go at it with both hands on the weapon, we can do our first tracing with both hands on our two-handed weapon. When we look at the runes for level 1, I'd probably be looking at, because again, we're a melee build, going to want to be able to etch our Whetstone rune on here for some bleed damage and some nice triggered invoke damage. I think Flame is a really useful choice as well here. And then if I'm going to go real high damage, I'm going to take the Diacritic rune to be able to add on our Intelligence ability modifier. And well, I actually think one of the best choices here might be, if you've got an ally that's using a shield, to give them a shield-based rune, or possibly there's a rune that also increases your movement speed, to be able to etch that onto a creature armor in the morning. I think those might be actually better choices. We're going to have fun with this build, and I'm going to say, what the heck, let's go ahead and grab our lightning rune. I hope you liked this quick look at the new class in the playtest. I'm going to have a link to the playtest in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, any feedback, please let me know. And please, if you do download the playtest, think about providing feedback to Paizo. They're always looking for the best feedback they can get. We have a little while till we get there, so try it out in a game or just read through it, get your thoughts together. I know I'm going to have mine. And as always, adventure on.